Jake's utility knife sliced through the final rope, and the woman collapsed forward into his arms. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair matted against her face and clothes torn from what looked like days in the wilderness. Her belly was enormous. She had to be 8 months along, maybe more. "Can you walk?" he whispered, already knowing time was running out. The voices were maybe half a mile away, but sound carried differently in these mountains. They could be closer. She nodded weakly, gripping his flannel shirt. "Sarah," she managed. "My name is Sarah, Jake. We need to move now." He helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left ankle and the way she winced with each breath. Whatever these people had done to her, wherever they'd brought her from, she'd been through hell. The rope burns on her wrists were infected, and there were bruises on her arms that looked suspiciously like fingerprints. "Maya, where are you, sweetheart?" The voice echoed through the trees, sickeningly sweet with an undercurrent of menace. "Come on out. We're not angry anymore." Sarah's entire body went rigid against him. "They call me Maya," she whispered. "It's not my name." Jake's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough in 12 years of military service to recognize the signs: trafficking, captivity, worse things he didn't want to imagine. The protective instincts he'd buried came roaring back to life, and for the first time in 3 years, the familiar weight of purpose settled on his shoulders. His cabin was 2 miles northeast, but that would be the first place they'd look if they had any tracking skills. The old mine shaft was closer, maybe 3/4 of a mile, but the terrain was rough and Sarah was in no condition for a difficult hike. "How many of them?" he asked, shouldering his pack and wrapping an arm around her waist to support her weight. 3, maybe 4. Her voice was barely audible. There was another man, but he stayed at the cars. Cars, plural. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. This was organized, planned. Jake's mind automatically catalogued the implications as he guided Sarah deeper into the forest, away from the voices. These people had resources, probably experience with this kind of thing. They wouldn't give up easily. They'd made it maybe 200 yards when Sarah stumbled, crying out softly as she grabbed her stomach. Jake caught her before she fell, feeling the rigid tension in her abdomen. "Contraction," she gasped. "They've been coming since yesterday." Of course they had, because this situation wasn't complicated enough already. Jake had delivered exactly 0 babies in his lifetime, and doing it while being hunted through the Colorado wilderness wasn't how he'd planned to start. How far apart? I don't know. 10 minutes? 15? She straightened up, determination replacing the pain in her eyes. "I can keep going." Jake believed her. There was steel underneath the terror, a strength that reminded him of some of the toughest soldiers he'd served with. But strength only went so far when you were exhausted, injured, and about to give birth. "Maya!" The voice was closer now, and Jake could hear at least 2 others crashing through the underbrush behind them. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jake made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over the past 3 years. Instead of continuing to run, he found a dense cluster of pines and guided Sarah behind them. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Her eyes widened as he shrugged off his pack and pulled out items he'd hoped never to use again. The tactical knife, the small pistol he'd told himself was just for mountain lions and bears. "What are you doing?" Jake met her gaze, seeing his own reflection in her dark eyes. A man about to become someone he'd promised never to be again. "Buying us time." The woman's eyes tracked his every movement as he knelt beside her, studying the restraints. Professional zip ties, not rope or cord, the kind law enforcement used, or people who knew what they were doing. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where she'd struggled against them, and the plastic had cut deep enough to leave permanent scars. "How long have you been here?" he asked, pulling a utility knife from his belt. Her mouth moved behind the duct tape, producing muffled sounds. He hesitated before reaching for the tape. "I'm going to remove this, but you need to stay quiet. Sound carries in these mountains." She nodded frantically. He peeled the tape away slowly, and she gasped, working her jaw and licking cracked lips. 2 days, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Maybe 3. I lost track. Thomas sliced through the zip ties with quick, efficient movements. She immediately brought her hands to her swollen belly, cradling it protectively. Now that he could see her clearly, he estimated she was maybe 7 months along, maybe 8. Her face was gaunt, dehydrated, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. "Water," he said, offering his canteen. She drank greedily until he pulled it away. Slowly. "You'll make yourself sick." "Thank you." Tears streamed down her dirt-stained cheeks. "I thought I was going to die here. My baby." "Can you walk?" He was already scanning the tree line, every instinct screaming that they needed to move. Whoever had done this wouldn't leave her here without planning to return. She struggled to her feet with his help, wincing. Her legs shook from days of being bound, circulation compromised. "I think so. My name is Sarah. Sarah Chen." He almost didn't give his real name. The habit of aliases died hard. "Thomas. Thomas. They killed my husband." Her voice broke, but she kept talking. "Shot him right in front of me. They were asking about money, about accounts, about things David never told me about." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Professional restraints, execution-style killing, financial interrogation. This had organized crime written all over it. The kind of people he'd spent 5 years running from. The kind who didn't leave loose ends. "We need to move, now." He shouldered his pack and started leading her away from the tree, but she stumbled after only a few steps. "I can't. My legs." Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, even pregnant. They'd been starving her. "Put your arms around my neck." As he carried her through the dense undergrowth, she continued her story in whispered fragments. David worked for a tech company, but there was other stuff, side projects. "I didn't ask questions because the money was good. We were going to buy a house, start over somewhere safe." She laughed bitterly. Safe. Thomas knew about side projects. In his former life, he'd tracked enough money laundering operations to recognize the pattern. Tech companies made perfect fronts, clean businesses with complex financial structures perfect for hiding dirty money. David Chen had probably been washing cash for the wrong people, maybe skimming a little off the top. It always ended the same way. "Did you see their faces?" 3 men. The leader was tall, thin, had a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Called himself Marcus. The other 2 were muscle, but Marcus was the one asking questions. Thomas's blood turned to ice water. Marcus Volkov, Russian mob, Chicago operation, and a man Thomas had put behind bars 6 years ago. Apparently, he'd gotten out. What kind of questions? About passwords, about offshore accounts. They seemed to think David had stolen $2 million. Sarah's grip tightened around his neck. But David wasn't a thief. He was careful, maybe too careful, but not a thief. 2 million was exactly the amount that had gone missing from the Kozlov family operation when Thomas's task force had brought it down. Money that had never been recovered, money that had haunted the investigation and probably contributed to Volkov walking free on a technicality. Now Thomas understood. David Chen hadn't stolen anything. He'd been laundering money for the Kozlovs, and when the operation collapsed, that money had gotten frozen in whatever system he'd been using. Volkov had spent years tracking it down, and David had been the key to recovering it. But if they'd killed David without getting what they wanted, and they'd left Sarah alive this long, it meant they weren't finished. They'd be back, probably with more questions, more pressure. Maybe they thought the money was hidden somewhere else, or that Sarah knew more than she was saying. Thomas reached his cabin as the sun began to set. The small structure sat in a natural clearing, solar panels on the roof, walls reinforced beyond what any normal retreat would require. Sarah stared at it with obvious relief. "You live here?" "Yeah." He set her down carefully on the porch. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. The men who took you, they're not going to stop looking, and now they're going to be looking for both of us." The woman's eyes followed his every movement as he worked to cut through the rope binding her wrists. Her breathing came in short, panic bursts, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the mountain chill. The bindings were professional-grade nylon cord, the kind that didn't fray easily under a blade. "Easy," he murmured, sawing carefully with his hunting knife. "Almost got it." She tried to speak around the gag, urgent sounds that made his chest tight with recognition. He'd heard that kind of desperation before, in places he'd sworn never to think about again. The rope finally gave way, and her arms fell forward, trembling from hours of being held in position. He moved to untie the gag, and she immediately gasped. "They're coming back. Tonight," they said. Her voice cracked, hoarse from the gag. "Please, we have to go." "Who's coming back?" He kept his voice level while his mind raced through tactical assessments he hadn't accessed in 5 years. "I don't know their real names. The one in charge, he's got a scar here." She traced a line down her left cheek with a shaking finger. "Russian accent, maybe Ukrainian. The other two, they just do what he says." Thomas felt ice settle in his stomach. He'd known men like that, had worked alongside some, had killed others. Professional operators who didn't leave loose ends. "How long have they had you?" 3 days, maybe 4. They kept moving me. She struggled to stand, and he caught her elbow as she swayed. "My name's Sarah Chen. I'm a journalist with the Post." Of course she was. Thomas helped her steady herself, noting the way she favored her left ankle and the bruising on her arms that spoke of rough handling. "What story were you working on?" "Human trafficking. Specifically, a pipeline moving women through the mountain passes between here and Canada." She looked up at him with desperate intensity. "They found out I was getting close to their operation. I had sources, documentation. Everything's in my laptop back at the motel in Clearwater Falls." Thomas was already moving, cutting the ropes around her ankles. Clearwater Falls was 30 miles down the mountain, a tiny logging town that barely qualified as a dot on most maps, remote enough for people to disappear without much notice. "You sure they're coming back tonight?" "The scar-faced one, Dmitri, he said they were moving me to a more permanent location after dark. Said this spot was getting too hot." Sarah rubbed circulation back into her wrists. "When I heard you coming up the trail, I thought—" She trailed off, studying his face. "You're not just some hiker, are you?" He didn't answer directly. The sun was already past its zenith, which gave them maybe 5 hours of daylight. In his experience, men like Dmitri preferred to move in darkness, but they'd also have the area scouted and probably cached supplies nearby. His cabin was 2 miles north through rough terrain, defensible, but also a trap if they were outnumbered. "Can you walk?" he asked. Sarah took a few tentative steps, wincing. "I can manage." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." Thomas shouldered his pack and adjusted the rifle strap. "We need to move fast. Can you tell me anything else about these men? Numbers, weapons, vehicles?" 3 total, like I said. They had handguns, at least. I saw them loading gear from a black SUV yesterday, but I don't know if that's still in the area. Sarah fell into step behind him as he started down a deer path that would take them away from the main trail. The third man, younger guy, he seemed nervous, kept checking his phone even though there's no signal up here. That detail caught Thomas's attention. No cell service meant the young one was either inexperienced or expecting satellite communication. Either way, it suggested their operation was bigger than just 3 men grabbing a journalist. They moved in silence for 20 minutes, Thomas setting a pace that pushed Sarah to her limits without breaking her. He could hear her labored breathing behind him, partly from exertion and partly from fear. Every 100 yards or so, he stopped to listen, scanning the forest for signs of pursuit. At the 3rd stop, Sarah grabbed his arm. "There's something else. Before they grabbed me, I was investigating a connection between the trafficking ring and someone local, someone with enough influence to keep the authorities from looking too hard. Someone in law enforcement? Or connected to it. My source was scared, said this went all the way to the top of the county sheriff's department." She paused, catching her breath. That's why I came up here alone. I couldn't trust anyone official. Thomas felt the familiar weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. 5 years of carefully maintained isolation, and now he was walking straight back into the world he'd tried to leave behind. But Sarah's story had the ring of truth, and pregnant women tied to trees didn't lie themselves there. "How far along are you?" he asked quietly. 16 weeks. Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "I can't let anything happen to my baby." The woman's fever broke just after midnight, but Marcus didn't allow himself to feel relief. He'd seen enough field medicine to know that infections could spike without warning, and the angry red lines around her wrist wounds still concerned him. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, mumbling fragments that made his blood run cold. "Please don't let him find me," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "The baby. He wants the baby." Marcus had spent the evening reinforcing his cabin's defenses, checking sight lines, and preparing contingencies he'd hoped never to use again. The habits of his former life came flooding back with disturbing ease, the way he automatically catalogued potential weapons, escape routes, and defensive positions. His hands remembered the weight of the Glock he'd retrieved from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. When dawn finally crept through the windows, the woman's eyes opened with startling clarity. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face and the careful distance he maintained. "You're not one of them," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." Marcus poured water into a tin cup and offered it to her. "How do you feel?" She struggled to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Like I've been dragged behind a truck." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I'm Sarah Chen." The name hit him like a physical blow. Chen. He'd heard that name before, in briefings from another life, connected to cases that had made veteran agents sick to their stomachs. If she was related to those files, "The men who took you," he said carefully. "How many were there?" "3 that I saw. Maybe more." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the water. "They've been hunting me for weeks, ever since I ran." Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. "Ran from where?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband's compound, Viktor Kozlov." The cup slipped from Marcus's fingers, clattering against the wooden floor. Kozlov. The name belonged to his nightmares, to case files thick with photographs that had haunted him for years. Human trafficking, forced labor, worse things that the FBI had spent a decade trying to prove. Marcus had been part of the task force that had gotten close, too close. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Sarah's eyes sharpened at his reaction. "You know that name." It wasn't a question, and Marcus found himself caught between the truth and the careful lies he'd built his new life around. "I know enough." "Then you know what he's capable of." Sarah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. "He's not just my husband. He owns me, bought me when I was 17. Her hand moved protectively over her stomach. "This baby, it's his heir, his property. He'll never stop looking." Marcus turned away, staring out the window at the forest that had sheltered him for 5 years. In the distance, a jay called out a warning to its mate. Everything felt fragile suddenly, like a house of cards in a hurricane. "How did you find this place?" he asked. "I didn't. I was just running." Sarah's reflection appeared beside his in the window glass. "They caught me 3 days ago. Said they were going to make an example of me when they dragged me back. Let the other girls know what happens when you try to leave." The casual way she said it, "other girls," made Marcus's jaw clench. He'd read the intelligence reports, seen the estimates. Kozlov's operation moved dozens of women every month, young ones mostly, girls who disappeared from bus stations and truck stops and were never seen again. "There's a town about 20 miles south," Marcus said finally. "Sheriff's Department, State Police Post. I could get you there." Sarah was already shaking her head. "He has people everywhere, police, judges, customs officials. How do you think he's stayed in business this long?" Marcus knew she was right. The task force had lost 3 witnesses that way, people who'd trusted the system only to end up in shallow graves or shipping containers bound for foreign ports. Then what do you want from me? Nothing. Sarah moved away from the window, her bare feet silent on the cabin floor. You've done enough. More than enough. I just need to rest for a day, maybe 2. Then I'll move on. But even as she said it, Marcus could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way her body trembled with each movement. She was in no condition to run, and they both knew it. Worse, if Kozlov's men were already this close, it meant they'd tracked her here somehow. Outside, the forest held its breath. Marcus checked his watch and felt time slipping away like water through his fingers. Somewhere out there, professional killers were closing in on his sanctuary. And for the first time in 5 years, Marcus Reeves realized he might not be able to run. The woman's fever broke sometime before dawn, her breathing finally settling into something that resembled normal sleep. Marcus had dozed fitfully in the wooden chair beside the bed, jerking awake every time a branch scraped against the cabin's exterior or the wind shifted direction. His rifle remained propped within arm's reach, and his ears stayed tuned to every sound filtering through the forest. When pale morning light began seeping through the small windows, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She tried to sit up too quickly and winced, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice rough from the sleepless night. "You're safe." She turned toward him, wariness flickering across her features despite his reassurance. In daylight, he could see more clearly what the darkness had hidden. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe late 20s, with auburn hair matted against her scalp and freckles scattered across pale cheeks. But it was her eyes that gave him pause, green and intelligent, holding a hardness that spoke of recent horrors. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My cabin, about 15 miles north of Copper Falls." He leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" She hesitated, studying his face with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Sarah. Sarah Chen." "I'm Marcus." He gestured toward a glass of water on the bedside table. "You should drink something. You were pretty dehydrated when I found you." She accepted the water gratefully, draining half the glass before speaking again. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night. You've been in and out." Marcus stood, needing to move, to do something with the nervous energy that had been building since he'd carried her through his door. "Are you hungry? I can make something." "Wait." Her voice stopped him at the doorway. "You said 15 miles from Copper Falls. That's almost 2 days from where they had me." The weight in her words made him turn back. "Where were you being held?" Sarah's grip tightened on the water glass. "I'm not sure exactly. Some kind of compound south of here. There were buildings, trailers, men with guns." She paused, her free hand moving protectively over her stomach. "They've been moving me around for weeks." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Armed compounds, organized kidnapping. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. Who are they? What did they want? "I don't know who they are, not really. But I know what they want." Her voice dropped even lower. "My baby. They want my baby." The simple statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd encountered human trafficking during his years in law enforcement, had seen the depths people would sink to for money. But this felt different, more personal somehow. Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Because of who the father is." She met his eyes directly. "My ex-husband is Daniel Reeves." The name meant nothing to Marcus initially, but something about the way she said it, the expectation in her expression, made him search his memory. Then it clicked. Newspaper headlines from before he'd retreated to the mountains, late-night news broadcasts about corruption scandals and federal investigations. "The senator," he said. "Former senator, and soon-to-be former free man, if the FBI gets their way." Sarah shifted on the bed, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Daniel's been running scared for months, his associates, the people he did business with. They know he's going to flip to save himself. They figure his child might be useful leverage. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his past pressing against his chest. Organized crime, federal investigations, high-profile targets. Everything he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. How did they find you? I thought I was hidden. Changed my name, moved across 3 states, paid cash for everything. Her voice cracked slightly, but they found me anyway. Grabbed me outside a clinic in Denver 3 weeks ago. How did you escape? I didn't. Not exactly. Sarah's eyes grew distant. They were arguing about something last night, got careless. 1 guard instead of 2. I hit him with a piece of firewood when he brought me food, took his keys. Jesus. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, processing the implications. They'll be looking for you. Probably already are. I know. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. I'm sorry I brought this to your door, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I just ran into the forest and kept going until I couldn't anymore. Marcus stared at her, seeing his carefully constructed isolation crumbling around the edges. Every instinct told him to get her to town, to the authorities, to anyone who could handle this professionally. But he also knew that professionals had failed her before, and time was a luxury neither of them possessed. How long until the baby comes? He asked. 6 weeks, maybe less. 6 weeks. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward the same inevitable conclusion. The woman's breathing had steadied into the rhythm of deep sleep, but Marcus remained awake, his back against the cabin wall, listening to every sound the mountain made. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting shifting shadows across the small room. His rifle lay across his knees, loaded and ready. He'd given her his bed and taken the floor, though sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Every crack of settling wood, every whisper of wind through the trees outside made his muscles tense. The men who'd taken her wouldn't give up easily. Men who bound pregnant women to trees in the wilderness weren't the type to cut their losses. Around 3 in the morning she stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Marcus turned to see her sitting up, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other pushing tangled hair from her face. "The baby?" he asked quietly. "Just moving around. Active little thing." She tried to smile, but it came out strained. "Thank you for everything. I don't even know your name." "Marcus." He hesitated, then added, "What's yours?" "Sarah. Sarah Chen." She studied his face in the dim light. "You're not what I expected when I saw you coming through the trees." "What did you expect?" "Someone scarier, I guess." "More wild." She shifted, wincing slightly. "But you knew exactly what to do with those restraints. And the way you carry that rifle. You've done this before, haven't you?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. The question hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. "We should try to get some rest. Tomorrow we figure out how to get you somewhere safe." "There isn't anywhere safe." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "These people, they're not going to stop. And they have resources, money, connections, technology. What did you see? What makes you worth all this trouble?" Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I worked for a pharmaceutical company, Nexus Industries. I was their lead data analyst, processing trial results, FDA submissions, that sort of thing." She paused, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. 3 months ago, I discovered something in the files. A drug trial that was supposed to have been terminated for safety issues, but the paperwork showed it was still active, still being tested. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Tested on who? Vulnerable populations, homeless people, undocumented immigrants, people in developing countries who didn't understand what they were signing up for. Her voice cracked. The side effects were significant, permanent neurological damage in some cases, death in others. You reported it. I tried, went through proper channels first, filed internal reports, requested meetings with senior management. They told me I was misreading the data, that the trials I'd found were old, inactive files that hadn't been properly archived. She laughed bitterly. But I knew what I'd seen. So I made copies. Marcus understood now why they'd wanted her isolated, why they'd taken such extreme measures. They found out. Someone must have been monitoring my computer access. 2 weeks after I made the copies, men in suits showed up at my apartment. Said they were FBI, but their badges looked wrong. They asked about my work, about what files I'd been accessing. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. I lied, said I didn't know what they were talking about, but I could tell they didn't believe me. So you ran. That night. Threw some things in a bag and drove north. I thought if I could get to Canada, maybe find a journalist or someone who'd listen. She shook her head. They caught up with me at a gas station near the border. Been moving me around ever since, trying to get me to tell them where the copies are. Marcus felt the familiar weight of other people's secrets settling on his shoulders. He'd come to these mountains to escape exactly this kind of complication, this kind of moral complexity that demanded action. But looking at Sarah, at the exhaustion and fear etched into her features, he knew he was already in too deep to walk away. Where are the copies? Safe deposit box in Seattle, keys sewn into my jacket lining. She met his eyes. I know you didn't ask for any of this. If you can just get me to a town with a police station, I can... Police might not be safe either. If these people have the resources you say they do, they might have people inside law enforcement too. The implications hung heavy between them. Marcus had seen how corruption worked, how money and influence could reach into places that were supposed to be clean. He'd trusted the wrong people before, and it had cost him everything. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus checked his watch, nearly 4 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, but he found himself already planning their next move. The cabin felt smaller with Sarah inside it. Marcus hadn't realized how the walls seemed to breathe with just his presence, expanding and contracting in a rhythm he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Now they felt tight, constricting, as if the very structure resented this intrusion into their carefully maintained solitude. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other gripping the mug of herbal tea he'd prepared. Steam rose between them like a veil, carrying the scent of chamomile and mint. She hadn't spoken since he'd brought her inside, but her eyes tracked his every movement as he gathered supplies from various corners of the room. We can't stay here, he said, stuffing ammunition into a worn canvas pack. They'll find this place eventually. Who are they? Sarah's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over a box of rifle cartridges. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he wasn't ready to explore. He'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd found her, running through possibilities in his mind like shuffling a deck of cards, each option more troubling than the last. I was hoping you could tell me, he said finally. Sarah shook her head, wincing as the movement seemed to aggravate some unseen injury. I don't remember much. There were men, 3 or 4 of them. They grabbed me outside the clinic in Millbrook. Everything after that is fragments. Voices, darkness, the smell of cigarettes and motor oil. Millbrook. Marcus knew the town, a small community about 40 miles south. Close enough to civilization to have a medical clinic, far enough from major cities to maintain the kind of anonymity that people like him appreciated. The fact that they'd taken her from there suggested either desperation or confidence, both equally dangerous qualities in men willing to kidnap a pregnant woman. Did you see their faces? He asked. One of them, thin face, scar through his left eyebrow. He kept talking about timing, about how everything had to be perfect. She paused, her breathing becoming shallow. Marcus, I think they want my baby. The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat, on the tactical considerations of escape and evasion, that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the deeper implications. A pregnant woman, taken and bound, held somewhere until what? Until she gave birth. The thought made his stomach clench with a familiar rage, the same white-hot fury that had driven him into these mountains in the first place. We need to move, he said, shouldering the pack. There's a hunting cabin about 8 miles north, past the ridge. It's been abandoned for years, but it's shelter, and more importantly, it's somewhere they won't expect. Sarah struggled to stand, her hand pressed against the small of her back. I don't know if I can walk that far. The baby, something's not right. I've been having contractions since yesterday. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. In all his years of military training, in all the scenarios he'd planned and prepared for during his time in isolation, the possibility of delivering a baby in the wilderness had never made the list. He was a man equipped to take life, not bring it into the world. How far apart? He asked, proud that his voice remained steady. Maybe 20 minutes now. They were closer this morning. 20 minutes. He did the math quickly, remembering fragments of medical training from his army days. If labor was progressing naturally, they might have hours. If complications arose, if the stress of captivity and escape had triggered something more urgent, they might have much less. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a shower of pine needles across the roof. The sound made Marcus's shoulders tense involuntarily. Every noise now carried the possibility of discovery, every shadow the potential for violence. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing yet. Sarah, he said, turning back to her, I need you to understand something. The men who took you, they're not the only danger out here. I've been hiding from people too. And if they find me, if they connect me to this situation, it becomes something much bigger than either of us can handle alone. She looked up at him with eyes that held more steel than he'd expected. What did you do? The question was simple, direct, deserving of an honest answer. But honesty was a luxury he'd abandoned years ago, buried under layers of necessity and survival. The truth about Marcus Webb, about what had driven him to this mountain and why certain people would kill to find him, was a story that could wait for another day. Something that needed doing, he said, and something I'd do again if I had to. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and Sarah's face went pale. Time was running out in more ways than one. The radio crackled to life at dawn, pulling Marcus from his restless sleep. Sarah stirred beside the dying fire, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as voices filtered through the static. Base to Unit 7. Any word from the search team? Marcus's blood ran cold. He'd been monitoring emergency frequencies for years, but this wasn't Park Service or local sheriff. The voices were too controlled, too professional. Military precision wrapped in civilian words. Negative. Base. No contact since yesterday evening. Want us to expand the grid? Affirmative. They're still out there somewhere. The client is getting impatient. Client. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his past settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd heard that clinical detachment before, in briefing rooms and black sites where human lives became assets and liabilities. Sarah's eyes found his across the cabin's dim interior. Who are they looking for? Us, he said simply, clicking off the radio. We need to move. Now. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Marcus led Sarah through a network of game trails he'd spent 5 years learning by heart. Every snapped twig made him pause, every bird call scrutinized for the wrong pitch or timing. Sarah moved better than he'd expected, her determination overriding her physical limitations. There's something I didn't tell you, she said during a brief rest, her breathing labored, about why they took me. Marcus handed her his water bottle, studying the tree line above them. Save your strength. You need to know. Her voice carried an urgency that made him focus on her completely. My father isn't just a judge. He's been investigating a network, private contractors, off-books operations, people who make problems disappear. The water bottle slipped from Marcus's fingers, clattering against the rocks. What kind of operations? The kind that don't officially exist. He's been building a case for months, connecting murders that look like accidents, witnesses who vanish, evidence that gets lost. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. They took me to stop him. But if something happens to me... He'll burn it all down, Marcus finished. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a message, a demonstration of reach and capability, and he'd just painted a target on his back by getting involved. The sound of rotors in the distance made them both freeze. Marcus grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward a cluster of boulders as a helicopter swept across the valley below. It moved in a search pattern, methodical and thorough. "They're not giving up," Sarah whispered. Marcus watched the aircraft bank and turn, his mind racing through options. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fade back into the mountains and let the world sort itself out without him. He'd survived this long by avoiding exactly this kind of situation. But the woman beside him was shivering despite the climbing sun, one hand pressed protectively over her unborn child. The same instinct that had made him cut her free from that tree now anchored him in place. "There's a ranger station about 10 miles northeast," he said finally. "If we can reach it, they'll have people watching it." Sarah's voice held the bitter wisdom of someone who'd learned not to trust in conventional safety. "These aren't ordinary criminals, Marcus. They have resources, connections, probably someone inside every agency that might help us." The helicopter was moving closer, its rotor wash bending the treetops. Marcus pressed deeper into the rocks, feeling trapped between the weight of his past and the impossibility of the present. Every skill he'd learned in Black Ops, every hard-won survival instinct, all of it useless if he couldn't think beyond simply running. "Then we make them come to us," he said, surprising himself with the words. Sarah stared at him. "What?" "They want to control the situation, choose the battlefield. But this is my territory now. I know every cave, every trail, every place where the radio signals die." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the cold clarity of tactical thinking. If they want a hunt, we give them one. The helicopter passed directly overhead, so low that Marcus could see the tactical gear of the men inside. Professional operators, just like he used to be. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You're talking about fighting them," Sarah said. "I'm talking about surviving them. There's a difference." Marcus waited until the aircraft moved on before emerging from cover. "But first, we need supplies, and I know where to get them." As they resumed climbing, Marcus tried to ignore the familiar adrenaline surge, the way his mind automatically began cataloging resources and calculating angles of attack. He'd sworn off this life, buried it under 5 years of deliberate isolation. But the past had found him anyway, wearing Sarah's face and carrying an innocent life that depended on choices he hadn't wanted to make. The hunter was about to become the hunted, whether he liked it or not. The radio crackled to life at dawn, jarring Ethan from his restless sleep. He'd positioned himself by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the tree line through the night. Sarah had finally dozed fitfully on his cot, one hand protectively curved over her belly. "Base to Unit 7. Come in, Unit 7. The voice was gravelly, impatient. Ethan had taken the radio from the dead man's pack, knowing it would be their lifeline to understanding what they faced. Now he listened as static filled the silence. "Unit 7, report your status immediately." Sarah stirred behind him, her breathing quickening with consciousness. The pregnancy made everything harder. She couldn't move fast, couldn't go long without rest, and the stress was clearly taking its toll. "They're looking for him," she whispered, joining Ethan by the window. "Which gives us maybe 12 hours before they realize something's wrong and send backup." Ethan studied the radio, weighing their options. "How many more are there?" "I never saw them all together. Maybe 6? 7? Her voice trembled. "Marcus keeps his operation compartmentalized. Nobody knows everything except him." The name hit Ethan like ice water. Marcus. It couldn't be the same one, could it? But even as he tried to dismiss it, pieces began clicking into place. The military precision of the operation, the resources, the reach that had allowed them to track Sarah across multiple states. "Marcus who?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "Kellerman, Marcus Kellerman." The rifle nearly slipped from Ethan's hands. 12 years, 12 years of hiding, of building this life in the mountains, of convincing himself that Marcus Kellerman would never find him. And now the bastard had literally delivered himself to Ethan's doorstep. You know him. It wasn't a question. Sarah was watching his face, seeing the recognition there. We have history. The words came out rough, loaded with old pain and newer rage. What does he want with you? Sarah's hand moved to her stomach again, that protective gesture that had become automatic. It's not me he wants, it's the baby. Why would he? Ethan stopped, understanding flooding through him. Jesus, it's his. Not by choice. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held depths of trauma that made Ethan's chest tighten. He's convinced the baby will be special, important to his plans. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The radio squawked again. All units, Unit 7 is non-responsive. Initiate sweep protocol. Target is contained within 5-mile radius of last known position. Ethan was already moving, grabbing supplies and shoving them into his pack. We need to go. Now. Where? Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing. You said yourself the nearest road is hours away, and I can't. There's another place, deeper in the mountains, but it means crossing some rough terrain. He paused, meeting her eyes. And it means I'm going to have to tell you things about myself that I've spent years trying to forget. She nodded without hesitation. Whatever it takes. They left through the cabin's back entrance, Ethan leading them along a barely visible deer path that wound up into the higher elevations. The morning mist provided some cover, but it would burn off within hours. After that, they'd be exposed on the mountainside. Marcus and I served together, Ethan said as they climbed, his voice low. Special operations, black budget stuff that officially never happened. Sarah saved her breath for walking, but he could feel her listening. He was brilliant, charismatic, and completely without conscience when it came to completing a mission. A branch caught Ethan's jacket, and he carefully extracted it without making noise, the job that ended it all. We were supposed to extract a scientist who'd been developing biological weapons. Instead, Marcus decided the man was too valuable to hand over to our superiors. They paused at a rocky outcropping, Ethan scanning the valley below for signs of pursuit. Nothing yet, but that wouldn't last. He killed 6 of our own team to cover his tracks, staged it to look like an enemy ambush. I was the only witness who survived, and only because I played dead until he left. Why didn't you report him? Ethan's laugh was bitter. To who? Marcus had connections everywhere. By the time I made it back to base, he'd already filed his report, made me out to be the traitor. I had 2 choices, run or die. A helicopter's distant thrum echoed across the mountains, still too far away to pinpoint their location, but getting closer. The place we're going. It's an old cache site. Food, weapons, communication equipment. If we can reach it, we might have a chance. And if we can't, Ethan checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. Then I finish what should have ended 12 years ago. The helicopter sound grew louder, and they pressed deeper into the wilderness, 2 fugitives racing against time and the ghosts of a past that had finally caught up with them. The radio crackled to life at dawn, Marcus's voice cutting through the static with urgent precision. They're moving faster than expected. 3 vehicles spotted on Ridge Road, maybe 2 hours out from your position. Jake's hands stilled on the rifle he'd been cleaning. 2 hours. He'd hoped for more time, but the mountains had their own timeline. Sarah sat up from where she'd been resting against the cabin wall, her face pale but determined. How many? Jake asked into the handset. Hard to tell from this distance, but I count at least 8, maybe 10. Professional gear, military surplus vehicles. These aren't weekend hunters, Jake. Sarah's breath caught. That's more than last time. Victor's not taking chances anymore. Jake studied the terrain map spread across his table, marking positions with a red pen. The cabin sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by dense forest and rocky outcroppings, defensible but only if you knew how to use the land. His eyes traced the old game trails he'd memorized over 5 years of solitude. There's a way out, he said, more to himself than to Sarah, but it means going up, not down. Up where? He pointed to the map's highest elevation marker. Devil's Backbone. It's a ridge system that connects to the old mining roads, treacherous as hell, especially for vehicles, but it leads to 3 different escape routes. Sarah struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her swollen belly. I can't make a climb like that. Not in my condition. You won't have to walk it. Jake moved to the back corner of the cabin, pulling away a canvas tarp. Underneath sat a modified ATV, its frame reinforced and painted in forest camouflage. Built this for emergencies. Never thought I'd need it for something like this. The radio crackled again. Jake, you there? I'm seeing movement on the southern approach too. They're trying to box you in. Jake's jaw tightened. Victor's people were smarter than he'd given them credit for. A coordinated approach meant someone with tactical experience was calling the shots. He grabbed his go bag from beneath the bed, cash, ammunition, medical supplies, and a clean identity he'd hoped never to use. We leave in 10 minutes, he told Sarah. Take only what you absolutely need. While she gathered her few possessions, Jake began his ritual of erasure. 5 years of life in this cabin, reduced to ash and memory. He fed documents into the wood stove, wiped down surfaces, removed anything that could provide DNA evidence or fingerprints. The mountain man named Jake Morrison would disappear with the smoke. From outside came the distant rumble of engines, still far off but growing closer. Sarah appeared at his shoulder, clutching a small backpack. Will you miss it? She asked, watching him work. Missing things is a luxury I can't afford. But his eyes lingered on the carved chess set he'd made during his first winter here, the leather-bound journal where he'd recorded weather patterns and wildlife observations. Small anchors to a life he'd convinced himself was enough. He loaded Sarah onto the ATV, securing her with makeshift straps to prevent falls. The engine caught on the first try. He'd maintained it religiously, understanding that in his world, mechanical failure meant death. The game trail began gently, winding through tall pines and scattered boulders. But within a quarter mile, it started climbing sharply. The ATV's knobby tires bit into loose shale and packed earth as Jake navigated switchbacks barely wide enough for the vehicle. Talk to me, he called over the engine noise. How bad is the pain? Manageable, Sarah shouted back, though her white knuckles on the safety straps suggested otherwise. The baby's not coming yet, if that's what you're asking. Behind them, the sound of engines grew louder, accompanied by the distant crack of breaking branches. Victor's men had reached the cabin. Jake allowed himself a grim smile, imagining their frustration at finding nothing but cold ashes and dead ends. The trail crested a false summit, revealing the true challenge ahead. Devil's Backbone stretched before them like a jagged spine of granite and loose rock. In good weather, experienced hikers took 6 hours to cross it on foot. Jake planned to do it in 90 minutes on an overloaded ATV with a pregnant woman whose life depended on his driving skills. Hold on, he warned, downshifting as they approached the first technical section. It gets interesting from here. The radio on his belt squawked one final time before the mountains swallowed the signal entirely. Marcus's voice was breaking up, lost to static and distance, but Jake caught enough words to understand. More vehicles, roadblocks, whatever sanctuary he'd imagined waited at the other end of Devil's Backbone was already compromised. He killed the radio and focused on the trail ahead. Sometimes survival wasn't about reaching safety. Sometimes it was about staying one step ahead of the wolves long enough to find new ground to defend. The radio crackled to life at dawn, pulling Marcus from the shallow sleep he'd managed against the cave wall. Sarah stirred beside him, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as consciousness returned. The static-filled transmission made them both freeze. Base to all units. Perimeter established. No movement detected overnight. Beginning systematic grid search at 0600. Marcus cursed silently. They'd brought in reinforcements, turned this into a proper manhunt. He crawled to the cave mouth and peered through the camouflaged entrance. In the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, he could make out figures moving methodically through the trees. Professional. organized. "How many?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "Too many." Marcus backed away from the entrance, his mind racing through their dwindling options. The cave had bought them time, but it would become a tomb if they stayed much longer. "We need to move before they tighten the noose." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her binding's aftermath. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and Marcus could see the toll their flight was taking on her body. Every instinct told him to find her medical attention, somewhere safe to rest, but safety was a luxury they couldn't afford. "There's a logging road about 2 miles northeast," he said, checking his rifle's ammunition count. "It's old, mostly overgrown, but it might get us to the main highway." "And then what?" Sarah's eyes held a desperation that cut through him. "These people won't stop, Marcus. You don't understand what they're capable of. Then help me understand." Marcus knelt beside her, keeping his voice low. "What did you see? What's worth all this?" Sarah's hands trembled as she wrapped them around her knees. "My husband, David, worked for a company called Meridian Industries. Government contracts," he said. "Boring stuff." She laughed bitterly. "I found out after he died that boring doesn't usually require armed security and numbered bank accounts." The radio crackled again. "Team 3, report your 20. Southwest quadrant clear, moving to Grid 7 Alpha." Marcus felt the walls closing in. Grid 7 Alpha was less than half a mile from their position. "Keep talking, but quietly." "What kind of contracts?" "Arms deals, but not to our military." Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "David found out they were selling to groups our government had sanctioned. When he tried to expose it, they killed him, made it look like an accident." "And you have proof?" Sarah nodded, her hand moving to the small of her back where she'd hidden the flash drive. "David was smarter than they gave him credit for. He documented everything before they caught on: financial records, shipping manifests, communications with buyers, enough to bring down some very powerful people." Marcus understood now why they were so desperate to silence her. Corporate malfeasance was one thing, but arms dealing with enemy forces was treason, the kind of secret that justified any level of violence to protect. "Team 2, we've got tracks here. 2 sets, heading northeast." Marcus's blood chilled. Northeast toward the logging road. Their pursuers were better than he'd hoped, following sign through terrain that would challenge most hunters. Military training, no doubt. The same kind of skills that had once been his specialty. "Change of plans," he whispered, shouldering his pack. "We go northwest, up the ridge." "That's deeper into the wilderness," Sarah protested. "I can barely make 2 miles on flat ground." "It's the last direction they'll expect." Marcus helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left ankle. "Sometimes you have to go backward to move forward." They slipped from the cave like shadows, Marcus leading them through a maze of deadfall and undergrowth that would mask their passage. Every few minutes he stopped to listen, passing the natural sounds of the forest from the deliberate movements of their hunters. The radio chatter grew fainter but never disappeared entirely, a constant reminder of the danger closing around them. After an hour of climbing, Sarah stumbled, catching herself against a tree with a sharp gasp. Marcus turned to find her pale and breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. "I need to rest," she whispered. Marcus scanned their surroundings. They were exposed here, visible from multiple angles, but Sarah's condition was deteriorating, and pushing her beyond her limits would only slow them down more. 5 minutes, no more. As Sarah sank gratefully onto a fallen log, Marcus caught a flash of movement in the valley below. 2 figures in tactical gear, moving with purpose through the trees they'd traversed an hour earlier. The hunters had found their trail and were closing the gap faster than expected. Marcus made his decision. Running would only delay the inevitable, and Sarah couldn't maintain this pace much longer. It was time to stop being prey and remind these men why he'd once been the hunter they feared. The abandoned ranger station sat like a broken tooth against the tree line, its windows dark and roof sagging under years of neglect. Marcus crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards out, studying the building through his rifle scope. Sarah pressed against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and quick. "I don't see anyone," she whispered. "That's what worries me." Marcus swept the scope across the surrounding forest. 3 vehicles were parked in the overgrown lot, 2 black SUVs and a silver sedan that looked out of place among the federal fleet. "They're here. Question is how many and where." A figure moved past one of the broken windows, then another. Marcus counted at least 4 distinct shapes moving through the building's interior. "There's supposed to be a radio in there?" Sarah asked. "Should be. Emergency communication array on the 2nd floor." Marcus lowered the rifle. "But we're not just walking through the front door." He'd been to this station before, years ago when he still wore a badge. The building was a maze of offices and storage rooms, with too many corners and blind spots, perfect for an ambush. "So what do we do?" Marcus studied the building's layout, mapping his memories against what he could see. "There's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the basement. Runs from the generator shed about 30 yards behind the main building. And you think they don't know about it? Depends how well they did their homework." He shouldered his pack. "Stay close and do exactly what I say. No questions, no hesitation." They worked their way through the dense undergrowth, moving parallel to the building until they reached the generator shed. The small concrete structure was half buried in the hillside, its metal door hanging open on rusted hinges. Marcus peered inside. The tunnel entrance was exactly where he remembered it. A maintenance hatch in the floor, large enough for a man to crawl through. He pried it open with his knife, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "This leads directly under the building," he whispered. "Comes up in the basement storage room. From there, we can reach the stairs without being seen." Sarah nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Her hand rested protectively over her belly. "Hey," he caught her chin gently. "I've done this before. We get in, we get to the radio, we call for help. In and out. What if they hear us? Then we run like hell." Marcus went first, crawling through the tunnel on his hands and knees. The passage was narrower than he remembered, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Behind him, Sarah's breathing echoed off the concrete walls. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. His knees scraped against loose gravel, and his back protested against the cramped position. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw light ahead. Pale illumination filtering down from the basement. He reached the access hatch and listened. Nothing but the distant sound of voices from somewhere above. Carefully, he pushed the hatch open and pulled himself into the storage room. The basement was exactly as he remembered. Rows of metal shelving lined with supplies, boxes of paperwork and outdated equipment. A single bare bulb cast harsh shadows across everything. Sarah emerged from the tunnel behind him, dirt streaking her face. Marcus helped her to her feet and pointed toward a stairwell in the far corner. They moved between the shelving units, stepping carefully over debris and broken glass. The voices upstairs were clearer now, at least 3 men, maybe 4. Marcus recognized the clipped tones of professional operators, the kind of men who killed for money rather than passion. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus held up a hand. Footsteps crossed the floor directly above their heads, heavy boots on old wooden planks. He waited until the sound moved away before starting up. The first floor was a maze of cubicles and offices, everything covered in dust and decay. Weak sunlight filtered through grimy windows, creating a patchwork of light and shadow. Marcus led Sarah along the wall, staying low and moving from cover to cover. The voices came from the main reception area, 3 men discussing search patterns and radio frequencies. They were coordinating with other teams, Marcus realized. This wasn't just about finding Sarah anymore. They were conducting a full-scale manhunt. The stairwell to the 2nd floor was in the building's center, uncomfortably close to where the men were talking. Marcus studied the layout, calculating angles and timing. "We need a distraction," he whispered to Sarah. Before she could respond, one of the voices stopped mid-sentence. Then came the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. "Movement in the basement," someone said. Southeast corner. Marcus's blood went cold. They had sensors, motion detectors or thermal imaging, something that had tracked their approach through the building. "Go," he hissed, pushing Sarah toward the stairs. "Second floor, end of the hall. Radio room. What about you? I'll buy you time. Just go." The sound of boots thundered across the floor above as Sarah disappeared up the stairwell. Marcus checked his rifle and stepped into the shadows, preparing for the fight he'd spent 5 years trying to avoid. The radio crackled to life at dawn, Marcus's voice cutting through the static like a blade. "Found their camp. 3 vehicles, maybe 8 men total. They're mobilizing." Jake's blood turned to ice as he pressed the transmit button. "How long do we have?" "Hour, maybe less." "They know where you are, Jake. Time to move." Sarah was already awake, her face pale but determined as she struggled to sit up. The makeshift shelter had kept them warm through the night, but Jake could see exhaustion etched in every line of her features. The baby was coming soon, too soon for what lay ahead. "We need to get you out of here," Jake said, helping her to her feet. Every movement sent another contraction rippling through her body, and she gripped his arm with white-knuckled intensity. "I can't," she gasped. "Jake, I can't run anymore." He looked into her eyes and saw the truth there. The labor was progressing faster than either of them had hoped. In a few hours, maybe less, she'd be giving birth whether they were safe or not. The sound of engines echoed across the valley, still distant but growing closer. Jake's mind raced through his options, each one more desperate than the last. The old mine shaft was defensible but had only one way out. The ranger station was too far, the river crossing would be impossible in her condition. Then he remembered the cave system behind the waterfall, narrow passages that would funnel attackers into a single line, multiple exits and fresh water. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best chance. "There's a place," he said, shouldering their supplies. "But we need to move now." Sarah nodded, biting back another cry as another contraction hit. Jake wrapped his arm around her waist, taking most of her weight as they began the treacherous climb toward the sound of rushing water. Behind them, the drone of engines grew louder. Jake caught glimpses of dust clouds through the trees, vehicles moving with military precision along the old logging roads. These weren't random thugs. They moved like professionals, like the kind of men he'd once worked alongside before everything went wrong. The waterfall came into view just as Sarah's legs gave out completely. She collapsed against a boulder, her breathing ragged and desperate. "The baby's coming," she whispered. "Jake, it's coming now." The engines were close enough now that he could distinguish individual vehicles. Jake estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before the first searchers reached this area. 10 minutes to get Sarah hidden, positioned, and ready for whatever was coming. He half-carried, half-dragged her behind the waterfall, the icy spray shocking them both into alertness. The cave mouth was narrow, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the space opened up into a natural chamber about the size of a small room. Sarah collapsed onto the sandy floor, her body racked with another powerful contraction. Jake spread out their sleeping bag and helped her onto it, his hands shaking as he tried to remember everything he'd learned about emergency childbirth during his military training. "Listen to me," he said, checking his rifle one last time. "I'm going to set up at the cave entrance. If they find us, stay quiet no matter what you hear. When this is over, there's a passage at the back of the cave that leads to the other side of the ridge. Can you remember that?" Sarah grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't leave me." "I won't go far," he promised, though they both knew it might be a lie. The sound of boots on stone reached them from outside. Jake positioned himself at the cave mouth, using the natural rock formations for cover. Through the curtain of falling water, he could see shapes moving among the trees. At least 4 men, all armed, all moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers. One of them gestured toward the waterfall, and Jake's heart sank. They'd found the trail. Behind him, Sarah stifled a cry as another contraction hit. The timing couldn't have been worse. She was fully in labor now, her body preparing to bring new life into the world just as death stalked them through the forest. Jake chambered around and steadied his breathing. He'd spent 5 years running from his past, building a life of peace in these mountains. But some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for. The woman behind him, the child about to be born, they represented everything he'd thought he'd lost when his world fell apart. The first figure appeared at the base of the waterfall, rifle raised, scanning for threats. Jake had a clear shot, but taking it would give away their position to the others. He held his breath and waited, knowing that in the next few minutes everything would change. From behind him came the soft, unmistakable sound of Sarah beginning to push. The baby was coming, whether they were ready or not. The abandoned mining office sat like a rotting tooth against the mountainside, its windows blown out decades ago, metal roof rusted through in places that let shafts of morning light slice through the gloom. Sarah crouched behind what remained of an overturned desk, her breathing shallow, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Marcus moved like a ghost through the debris-strewn space, checking sight lines through the broken windows. His rifle felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from another life flooding back, despite the years he'd spent trying to forget. Outside, the forest was too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "How many?" Sarah whispered, though she already knew the answer would be too many. 5 vehicles came up the access road an hour ago. Marcus kept his voice low, eyes never leaving the tree line. Vic's not taking any chances this time. The radio Marcus had taken from the dead man crackled to life. Alpha team in position on the north ridge. Beta team moving to secure the mine entrance. No movement detected. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She'd hoped distance and time might have cooled Vic's obsession with recovering what she'd taken. The documents hidden in her jacket felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, evidence of money laundering, human trafficking, connections that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. Her insurance policy had become everyone's death warrant. Marcus caught her eye and held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the back of the building where a partially collapsed tunnel led deeper into the mountain. She nodded, understanding. 3 minutes before they moved, the radio buzzed again. "Charlie team has the cabin surrounded. Structure appears abandoned. Moving to search." A bitter smile crossed Marcus's face. Let them waste time on the decoy site he'd led them to, complete with cold ashes in the fireplace, and his scent deliberately left on the bedding. Every minute they spent searching empty buildings was another minute of life. Sarah studied his profile as he watched the forest. There was something different about him now, a hardness that hadn't been there when he'd first found her bound to that tree. She was seeing the man he'd been before the mountains, before whatever had driven him to seek isolation. The transformation was both reassuring and terrifying. "Movement, 2 o'clock, he breathed. Through a gap in the rusted metal siding, Sarah caught a glimpse of tactical gear moving between the trees, professional, coordinated. Vic had brought serious firepower this time. Marcus checked his watch. Time to go. They moved in practiced silence toward the tunnel entrance. 3 days of constant flight had taught them to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's movements. Sarah had never imagined she could move so quietly while 8 months pregnant, but desperation was a powerful teacher. The tunnel mouth yawned before them, a black throat leading into the mountain's belly. Marcus had scouted it yesterday while she rested, pronouncing it passable but treacherous. Old mine shafts were graveyards waiting to happen, but staying above ground meant certain death. "Contact!" The radio erupted with static and shouting. Shots fired from the mining office. Sarah's blood froze. They were still 20 feet from the tunnel. Marcus grabbed her hand, pulling her forward as gunfire erupted behind them. Not aimed at them. Something else had drawn their attention. Through the chaos of radio chatter, she caught fragments, muzzle flash from the upper level and suppress and advance. They reached the tunnel as boots thundered through the forest toward the building. Marcus switched on a small flashlight, its beam revealing rough-hewn walls and rotted support timbers. The air smelled of decay and standing water. "Stay close," he whispered, leading her into darkness. The tunnel sloped downward, forcing them to move carefully on loose stone and patches of mud. Behind them, the gunfire intensified. Someone was definitely shooting back at Vic's men, buying them precious time. Marcus had mentioned seeing other vehicles on distant fire roads. Perhaps someone else had their own score to settle. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the confined space. Sarah's breathing sounded unnaturally loud in her ears. The baby kicked hard, making her stumble. Marcus's hand immediately steadied her. "How much further?" she gasped. "The maps showed this connects to the main shaft system. From there, we can reach the old processing plant on the valley floor. If the tunnel didn't collapse first, if they didn't get lost in the maze of abandoned workings, if Vic's men didn't find the entrance before they reached safety, too many ifs. But moving forward was their only choice." The gunfire above faded as they descended deeper into the mountain's heart, swallowed by stone and shadow and the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The helicopter's rotors cut through the mountain air like steel blades, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus pressed his back against the granite outcropping, feeling Sarah's trembling body beside him as they crouched in the narrow crevice he'd found just moments before the aircraft crested the ridge. "They're using thermal imaging," he whispered, pulling the emergency blanket tighter around them both. The metallic material would mask their heat signatures, but only if they stayed perfectly still. "Don't move, don't even breathe heavy." Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her grip desperate. The contractions had been coming every 20 minutes now, and he could see the fear in her eyes, not just of their pursuers, but of what was happening to her body. They were running out of time on multiple fronts. The helicopter hovered directly overhead, its searchlight painting the mountainside in harsh white circles. Through a gap in the rock, Marcus watched armed figures rappelling down onto the ledge where they'd been standing just minutes before. Professional, military-grade equipment. These weren't the same men from the cabin. This was Valdez's cleanup crew. Marcus recognized the lead operative immediately. Viktor Kozlov, Russian special forces turned mercenary with a reputation for never leaving loose ends. Marcus had crossed paths with him twice during his CIA days, and both times had ended badly for everyone involved. "Tracks lead this way." Victor's accented voice carried clearly in the thin air. "They can't have gone far. The woman's condition will slow them down." The helicopter moved past their hiding spot, continuing its sweep pattern down the slope. Marcus waited until the sound faded before pulling Sarah deeper into the crevice. His mind raced through their options, none of them good. The trail they'd been following was a dead end, literally. It terminated at a sheer cliff face with nowhere to go but down. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with pain. "Something's wrong. The baby—" He looked down and saw the dark stain spreading across her pants. Blood. Too much blood. "How far along are you exactly?" His field medic training kicked in, assessing the situation with clinical detachment even as panic threatened to overwhelm him. 32 weeks, maybe 33. Another contraction hit her, and she bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. Premature labor complicated everything. Even if they somehow escaped Valdez's men, Sarah needed medical attention immediately. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and that was if they had a vehicle. On foot, through wilderness, it might as well be on another planet. The sound of boots on rock echoed from somewhere above them. Victor's team was working their way methodically down the cliff face, checking every possible hiding spot. Marcus estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before the searchers reached their position. He pulled out his remaining supplies, 2 protein bars, a half-empty water bottle, his service pistol with 6 rounds left, and the encrypted satellite phone he'd sworn never to use again. The phone that would bring his old life crashing back into his new one, destroying the peace he'd built in these mountains. But looking at Sarah, really looking at her, He realized that peace had already been shattered the moment he'd found her tied to that tree. Some lines, once crossed, changed everything. "I'm going to make a call," he said quietly, powering up the device. "People are going to come for us, people from my past." "What kind of people?" Sarah asked, though another contraction cut off her ability to say more. "The kind that can get us out of this." He hoped that was still true. 5 years was a long time in the intelligence world. Old alliances shifted, debts expired, and Marcus had burned more than a few bridges on his way out. The phone found a signal, weak but stable. Marcus scrolled through the encrypted contacts he'd never deleted, stopping on one name, Elena Vasquez. Former CIA, now running private security for very rich, very paranoid clients. They'd been partners once, before everything went sideways in Sarajevo, before Marcus had learned exactly how far the agency would go to protect its interests. Before he could second-guess himself, Marcus hit the call button. "Ghost protocols are meant to stay buried, Marcus." Elena's voice came through clear, despite the static. She hadn't changed her contact protocols in 5 years. "I need an extraction. 2 people, 1 civilian in medical distress. Hostile pursuit, professional grade." A long pause. "You're supposed to be dead." Details. "Are you operational in Colorado?" Define operational. Helicopter, medical team. Enough firepower to handle Russian contractors. Another pause, longer this time. In the distance, Victor's voice called out coordinates to his team. They were getting closer. "Send coordinates," Elena said finally. "And Marcus, this makes us even. After this, don't call again." "Understood." He transmitted their GPS location and powered down the phone. Above them, a rifle bolt clicked into position. Victor had found their trail. The radio crackled to life at 4:17 in the morning, cutting through the silence like a blade. Marcus jerked awake from his position by the window, rifle still across his lap. Sarah stirred from the couch, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Base to all units. We have movement on the perimeter. Southeast quadrant, approximately 2 clicks from the cabin." Marcus grabbed the handset. "How many?" "Thermal shows at least 6, maybe 8. They're moving in a coordinated pattern. Military discipline." Sarah sat up, fear etched across her face in the dim lamplight. "They found us." "Maybe." Marcus was already moving, checking his weapons, securing ammunition. "Could be a probe. Testing our defenses." But even as he said it, he knew better. Viktor Kozlov didn't send probes. When he moved, it was with precision and overwhelming force. The old bastard had finally tracked them down. The radio squawked again. "Marcus, you need to see this. I've got eyes on the approach through the scope. These aren't local muscle." Marcus keyed the mic. "What do you see, Ben?" "Military gear, night vision, suppressed weapons. And Marcus, I think I see Kozlov himself. Big guy, silver hair, moving like he owns the mountain." Sarah's sharp intake of breath filled the room. She struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the couch arm. "He's here. God, he's actually here." Marcus felt the familiar cold settle over him, the same ice that had kept him alive through dozens of operations in places that didn't exist on any map. His past and present were about to collide, and the shockwave would determine whether they lived or died. "Sarah, listen to me." He moved to her, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "Remember the plan. The bunker beneath the cabin has supplies for 3 days. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft, 1/2 mile north. If things go sideways, I'm not leaving you to face him alone." "You're not leaving me. You're protecting our child." The words came out harder than he intended, but they had the desired effect. Her protests died, replaced by grim understanding. The radio came alive with urgent chatter. His people were in position, but Marcus knew it wouldn't be enough. Kozlov had resources, trained killers who viewed human life as currency to be spent. The mountain men were skilled, but they were hunters and trappers, not soldiers. "All units, this is Marcus. Do not engage until my signal. Repeat, hold your positions." He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, extinguishing the lamp, checking sight lines through the reinforced windows. The structure had been modified over the years, turned into something between a home and a fortress. But fortresses could become tombs if you didn't know when to abandon them. Through the kitchen window, he caught movement in the tree line, a flash of muzzle light that vanished almost instantly. They were professionals, but the mountain gave up its secrets to those who knew how to listen. Sarah appeared beside him, having moved with surprising stealth for someone 8 months pregnant. "The back window," she whispered. "I saw something." Marcus nodded. They were being surrounded, which meant Kozlov wanted them alive. Dead, they were worthless. Alive, they could be questioned, tortured, used as leverage. It was a tactical advantage, but a temporary one. "Time to go," he said, leading her toward the hidden entrance to the bunker. The floorboards lifted away to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. "Remember what I told you about the tunnel. If you hear sustained gunfire, you run. Don't look back, don't wait for me. And if I don't hear gunfire—" Marcus paused at the edge of the opening. "Then I'll come for you when it's over." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, her lips warm against his. When they separated, her eyes held a determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her courage in the first place. "Come back to us," she whispered. "Count on it." As she disappeared into the bunker, Marcus sealed the entrance and moved to his prepared position. The radio whispered with reports from his scattered allies, painting a picture of tightening nooses and dwindling options. But Marcus had spent 15 years on this mountain, learning every stone, every shadow, every secret path carved by wind and water. Kozlov might have superior numbers and equipment, but this was Marcus's territory now. The first window exploded inward in a shower of glass and wood splinters. Marcus rolled behind the heavy oak table he'd positioned for exactly this moment, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that transformed fear into focus. Outside, a voice called through the darkness in accented English, "Marcus Webb, we know you're in there. We know about the woman. Come out, and perhaps we can discuss this like civilized men." Marcus smiled grimly and chambered around. Viktor Kozlov had finally come calling, but he was about to discover that some ghosts fought back. The cabin felt smaller now, cramped with tension and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Elena sat at the wooden table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed different somehow, sharper, more urgent. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound could herald their arrival. Marcus stood by the window, his rifle within arm's reach. He'd been there for the better part of an hour, watching the tree line with the practiced patience of someone who understood that survival often came down to seeing the enemy before they saw you. But patience was becoming a luxury they couldn't afford. "How long do you think we have?" Elena's voice was steady, but he caught the tremor beneath it. "Not long enough." Marcus turned from the window. "Chen's people are good, but they're not mountain people. They'll be moving slower than they want to, especially if they're trying to stay quiet. But they'll get here." Elena nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby had been active all morning, as if sensing the tension that permeated everything around them. "I've been thinking about what you said, about leaving, and where would we go? Really, Marcus, I don't have anywhere safe. No family that isn't already compromised, no friends who could protect us from someone like Chen. And you," she gestured toward the cabin, encompassing his entire world with the movement. "This is your sanctuary, your peace. If we run, you lose that forever." Marcus had been wrestling with the same thoughts. The cabin represented 15 years of careful construction, not just the physical structure, but the entire life he'd built around it. The routines, the solitude, the carefully maintained distance from everything that could hurt him. Leaving meant abandoning all of it, stepping back into a world that had already tried to destroy him once. But staying meant something else entirely. "There's a third option," he said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. Elena looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Marcus moved away from the window, settling into the chair across from her. His hands, scarred and weathered from years of mountain living, lay flat on the table between them. I mean, we don't run, and we don't just defend, we end this. The silence stretched between them, filled with the implications of what he was suggesting. Elena searched his face, seeing something there that hadn't been present before, a hardness that spoke of the man he'd been before the mountains claimed him. You're talking about going after Chen directly. I'm talking about making sure this never happens again. To you, to your baby, to anyone else. Marcus's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Chen built his empire on the assumption that people like us will always run, always hide, that we'll never fight back with the same ruthlessness he brings to the table. Elena set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. And you think you can do that? Match his ruthlessness? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus thought about the man he'd been before, the soldier who'd made impossible choices in impossible situations, who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something equally dangerous. That man felt very close now, separated only by the thin membrane of the peace he'd built in these mountains. I think, he said slowly, that some things are worth fighting for, even if it means losing who you've tried to become. Elena reached across the table, her fingers covering his. Marcus, I can't ask you to do that. I won't ask you to destroy the life you've built for someone you barely know. But that wasn't true anymore, and they both knew it. Over the past days, through shared fear and tentative trust, something had grown between them. Not love, that would take time they didn't have, but something deeper than mere circumstance. A recognition, perhaps, of two souls who understood what it meant to carry burdens too heavy for most people to comprehend. You're not asking, Marcus said. I'm choosing. The sound of a branch snapping somewhere in the distance made them both freeze. Marcus was at the window in seconds, scanning the tree line with renewed intensity. There, movement among the pines, too deliberate to be wildlife. They're here, he whispered. Elena rose from the table, moving to the back of the cabin where Marcus had prepared a hiding place behind a false wall. But she paused at the threshold, looking back at him. Whatever happens, she said, thank you for giving me back hope. Marcus checked his rifle, chambering around with practiced efficiency. The sound echoed in the cabin like a promise or a threat. Save the thanks, he said, his eyes never leaving the approaching figures. This isn't over yet. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Marcus finished loading the last of his supplies into the truck. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the woods, 3 days of waiting for law enforcement to finish their investigation and clear the scene. Now, finally, they could leave. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. The baby had been moving more frequently since the ordeal, as if sensing the change coming in their lives. Dr. Peterson had assured them both mother and child were healthy, despite everything they'd endured. You sure about this? Marcus asked, sliding behind the wheel. His fingers drummed nervously against the steering wheel as he looked out at the cabin that had been his sanctuary for so many years. Sarah reached over and placed her hand over his. We've been through this. I can't raise a baby up here, and you can't keep running from who you used to be. Maybe it's time we both stopped hiding. The drive down the mountain was slower than usual. Marcus found himself memorizing every curve, every familiar landmark. The old oak where he'd carved his initials as a foolish romantic gesture during his first week here. The creek where he'd learned to fish again after years of city living. The overlook where he'd made the decision to disappear from his old life entirely. Tell me about Seattle, Sarah said, as they reached the main highway. Rainy, crowded, good coffee. Marcus managed a weak smile. I had a practice there before everything went wrong, criminal defense mostly. I was good at it, maybe too good. The case that made you run? Marcus nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I got a client acquitted when I knew he was guilty, knew he'd hurt people and would probably do it again. 2 weeks after the verdict, he killed a family of 4. The prosecution had botched the evidence collection, gave me the opening I needed to create reasonable doubt. Legally, I did my job. Morally, you can't blame yourself for what someone else chose to do. Can't I? I enabled it. I was so focused on winning, on being the best defense attorney in the city, that I forgot there were real consequences to the games we played in court. The memory still tasted bitter in his mouth. The media crucified me. Death threats, protesters outside my office. But the worst part was looking in the mirror and knowing they were right. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the mountain growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Sarah dozed fitfully, her head against the window, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Marcus thought about Detective Rodriguez's visit yesterday. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Tommy Vega's operation. Sarah hadn't been his only victim. There had been others over the years, women who'd disappeared without a trace. The detective had been careful with the details, but Marcus could read between the lines. Sarah was lucky to be alive. "What made you change your mind?" Sarah asked suddenly, her eyes still closed. "About helping me, I mean. When you first found me, you almost walked away." Marcus considered the question. "Fear, I guess. I'd spent 5 years convincing myself that isolation was penance, that I deserved to be alone with my guilt. But seeing you there, seeing someone who needed help and knowing I was the only one who could provide it," he paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe redemption isn't about punishing yourself. Maybe it's about choosing to do better when the opportunity presents itself. And now? Now we figure out what comes next. Together." As they entered the outskirts of civilization, Marcus felt the familiar anxiety creeping in. Traffic lights, strip malls, the constant hum of human activity. For 5 years, he'd avoided all of this, content to lose himself in the rhythms of mountain life. But Sarah was right. Running had its limits, and despite his fears, the idea of starting over, really starting over, not just hiding, held an unexpected appeal. There, Sarah pointed to a small diner ahead. "Can we stop?" "The baby's hungry." Marcus pulled into the parking lot, noting how easily she'd begun speaking for the unborn child, how naturally she'd stepped into the role of protector. He envied her that certainty, that instinctive knowledge of what came next. Inside the diner, over coffee and pancakes, they began making plans. Sarah would stay with her sister in Portland until the baby came. Marcus would return to Seattle, see about reinstating his license, maybe find work with a legal aid society this time. Help people who actually needed it, rather than those who could simply afford it. "No more running," Sarah said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "No more hiding," Marcus agreed, clinking his cup against hers. Outside, the world waited with all its complications and possibilities, but for the first time in years, Marcus felt ready to face it.